Welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, June 17th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the 2026 United States Senate election in the state of Maine. Now, if you've been covering elections with me for the past decade, you'll know that Maine has been a unique point of interest for Democrats, as it has been remarkably unwinnable in the Senate elections, as Susan Collins, the Republican senator from Maine, the senior senator from the state, has been serving in Congress for a very long time. And in 2026, she intends to run for re-election, as many Democrats vacate from this race, instead opting to run for re-election in the House of Representatives or run for governor across the state, as no major contender has entered into the race on the Democratic side. Now, the Maine Senate race is one that is definitely going to be very interesting to watch, just as we see who decides ultimately to enter into this race. Now, 6 years ago, that was the first time we actually covered this Senate class seat for the state of Maine, when Susan Collins ran against then Speaker of the Maine House, Sarah Gideon, in the 2020 Senate elections, also coinciding, of course, with the 2020 presidential election. And if you remember the result here, Democrats ended up with a defeat that was upwards of roughly 8 points across the state, as Joe Biden won the state by roughly 9 points. Susan Collins defeated Sarah Gideon 51 to 42.4. Lisa Savage, the independent, who was aligned with the Democrats, was a ranked choice voting situation in Maine, but it was obviously not tabulated after the first round resulted in Susan Collins winning outright. But it was a 2020 race that was certainly one to watch, as Democrats were hopeful that in the 2020 Senate races, they would take down Susan Collins. But they lost, and 6 years later, they're now up where Susan Collins intends to run for re-election, but no mainstream Democrat has decided that they were going to run in this Senate race. Now, what we saw was that there was a lot of speculation around two people in particular. If you look back at that 2020 map here, you'll see that it was blue on the presidential level, and it was also blue on the congressional level too. You can see it on the House, where Shelley Pingree, the incumbent Democratic representative from Maine's 1st District, won by a margin of roughly 24 points. In the countering district, the 2nd District, which voted for Donald Trump in 2020 and 2024, Jared Golden, the Democrat, ended up winning by roughly 6 points. But in 2026, neither of these two candidates, Shelley Pingree or Jared Golden, have decided that they want to run for Senate. Jared Golden instead says, "I'm running for re-election in Maine's 2nd District, and in that 1st District, Shelley Pingree is the same." And that's why it's been a consistent point of frustration for the Democrats in the state of Maine, simply because they just can't find anybody who has any type of notable title to their name to declare already or announce that they want to run, or even are considering running in this race. And looking at my most recent Senate election prediction, it really is a sore thumb for Democrats. It sticks out because of the fact that it is quite red in a state that is otherwise quite blue. Iowa, Ohio, Florida, Texas, Alaska, Nebraska, and Maine all share a characterization, but only one thing separates Maine from the rest, and that it's Maine voted for Kamala Harris in the last election, whereas the other states did not. And it wasn't as if the other states voted for Donald Trump by just a narrow margin. Maine might have been a little bit closer on the end for Kamala Harris, but looking at the overall margin, it was 7 points for Harris. Every other state that I just mentioned voted for Donald Trump by double digits, 10 points, 15 points, in some cases 20 points. And what that means here is that if Maine is sharing a characterization, something is fundamentally wrong about the current state of the race for Democrats in 2026. And so looking at who might be running in the next election in this state, so far it's two people. Someone who was Deputy Secretary of the Maryland Department of the Environment. I love my home state of Maryland, but it is not the state of Maine. And looking at the Democratic side, another candidate on the Democratic side, Jordan Wood, who was former Chief of Staff to California U.S. Representative Katie Porter, who ran for Senate in 2024, lost, and is now running for governor. And so what that leaves us with here is a list of those who have publicly expressed interest: a former state senator and the incumbent Speaker of the Maine House of Representatives. Now, alone, it seems as if the Speaker of the Maine House might end up being a good candidate in the general election. Unfortunately, Democrats tried that in 2020, and what happened was ultimately that Susan Collins won the race. Now, 2020 is a very different set of circumstances from 2026. I will say, if Sarah Gideon had the ranked choice voting tabulation actually, all the way tabulated to the final round, chances are it probably would have been a 3 or 4 point race, not a 9-point race that would have led itself to thinking that Susan Collins is entirely unbeatable. But since it didn't tabulate, the race looks very difficult, because what it showed was that although Joe Biden was winning the state by 9, so was Susan Collins. That's an 18-point swing in the same race, the same voters, the same people that said, I want to defeat Donald Trump at the top of the ticket, but I'm willing to re-elect Susan Collins. And her electoral history largely does speak for itself. When you take a look at how long Susan Collins has been in office, you have to think there's a reason why she does so well. In 2002, she was elected, 1996 rather, she was elected with 49.18% of the vote. But since then, that has in fact been the closest race that she has faced. In 2002, she won by 16. In 2008, same ballot that Barack Obama was winning nationally with 365 electoral votes. Democrats had over 240 seats in the House of Representatives. Democrats had a majority in the Senate. That was 59 seats that eventually became 60. And yet, Maine on the same ballot voted for Susan Collins with 61% of the vote. 6 years later, Susan Collins wins with 68% of the vote. So it's a margin that was narrowed down from 35 points in 2014 to 9 points in 2020, but it's still enough so the Democrats are worried. They don't know who they want to run, and of the candidates left, the only real one that seems to be in a very strong position, and very strong means they win by maybe 3 points, is incumbent Governor Janet Mills, who at this current day and age is 77 years old. And so when you think about Janet Mills as a candidate, sure, she has an impressive electoral history. Won and defeated a Republican incumbent in 2018. Then, 4 years later, defied the odds against the same Republican nominee and Republican governor, or actually, sorry, not the same one because he was term limited, decided to run again in 22, lost by 13 points, despite it being a very not so great year for Democrats nationally. In 2026, she can't run for re-election, but age is certainly a factor. She's older than Susan Collins, and at the same time, this race should have been in a much better position for national Democrats. Because as I said, it isn't just that Jared Golden and Shelley Pingree want to run for re-election. It's that everybody else who might have been in a strong enough position to run for Senate has decided they want to run for governor. Here we have the Maine Secretary of State running for governor, the former president of the Maine Senate running for governor. Angus King III, if you recognize his name, it's because you should. Because Angus King is a name well known in Maine politics because he was the former governor and then became a United States Senator and is an independent who caucuses with the Democratic Party. Everybody in Maine knows Angus King. Democrats and Republicans alike try to challenge him, and as an independent, just simply is remarkably unbeatable in the same way that Susan Collins is. 2012, he ran against a Democrat and a Republican, won his race. In 2018, ran against a Democrat and a Republican, won his race. In 2024, ran against a Democrat and a Republican and won his race. In 2026, what we're finding is that right now, his son is deciding that he wants to run for governor using that high-profile name ID. Wouldn't it be interesting, though, right? Regardless of partisan politics, to have two, both of your Senate delegation being father, son, both with the same name. I think it'd be really interesting. Very easy for campaigning. You can just reuse the signs. Point is, though, putting that aside, obviously in jest, Angus King III deciding to run for governor. And another child, Hannah Pingree, who is the daughter of incumbent U.S. Representative Shelley Pingree, instead of running for Senate, is now deciding to run for governor. And when you take a look at, where we are on the broad strokes for the governor level, Democrats have a stacked bench. The Republican side, I really wouldn't be that worried if I was a Democrat in the state of Maine. When I see who has, decided that they want to run on the Republican side, it just simply isn't anyone that's really jumping out to me. Sure, some people have thought that they might want to run, but because the bench also just doesn't have that many Republican politicians, just simply put, the race here is the Democratic Party's race to win in the Maine governor race. On the Senate side, the Republican Party's race to win and lose, which it looks like they're on track for victory. And so Democrats really need to get things locked down and together if they want a chance of winning the Senate race in Maine. Because right now it is so heavily lopsided in favor of Susan Collins, and this could be a very, very easily missed opportunity. That is the thing that I think has been the point of frustration primarily for Democrats, isn't that Susan Collins keeps winning. It's that Democrats, in a way, in 2026, might just let her win. It reminds me of races that Democrats and Republicans sometimes just don't contest. Why? Because they think it's a foregone conclusion. And because they can't build up enough inspiration or of a campaign for Democrats who could actually take this race and win it. Now, I think that Janet Mills actually would be a strong candidate. Putting age aside, she has everything that it makes sense on paper. She won in 2018. She won against a Republican technical incumbent in 22 by an even larger margin. And coming into 2026, she holds a high approval rating. Does it mean it will be an easy victory? Absolutely not. Susan Collins is an electoral juggernaut. That's why she's staying so long. But in a day and age where the Senate delegations often reflect that of the presidential election and how the state votes on the presidential level, it would be very interesting to see if Maine continues to be one of those states that defies the odds. Because here's the current Senate map of where we are right now. Every single state on here that is, solid red and solid blue, barring a few exceptions, has voted that way in the last presidential election or sometime in the past 2 presidential elections. For instance, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, states that Donald Trump might have won in the last cycle, but voted for Biden in 2020. Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, it makes sense that Wisconsin and Pennsylvania have split delegations. But for the remainder of these states have largely voted the same way in the last 6 presidential last 5 presidential elections, right? When you take a look, or even in the day and age of Donald Trump, the past 3 presidential elections, Iowa, Ohio, having 2 Republicans makes sense. In the last congressional delegation, when you look at the old Congress, Montana had a Democrat, no longer. Ohio had a Democrat, no longer. West Virginia had a Democrat, no longer. Why? Because those states voted for Donald Trump 3 times and finally got around to voting for their respective party on the Senate level. The only state here that really stands out is Maine, because it hasn't voted for a Republican on the presidential level once in the 21st century. Once. Since the year 2000 hit, since everybody thought the computers would crash in the year 2000. Republicans haven't won a presidential election in Maine. Maybe they'll get the 2nd district, but they certainly weren't winning it statewide. So, where are we now in 2026? Not so great for Democrats given where it is. So, looking at the 2026 Senate race, Democrats are in a position where they could do very well in Maine. They could flip Maine for the first time in a very long time. And yet, they simply cannot find a candidate to run. And I know it's difficult. I mean, I'm not someone who is a recruiter. I'm not someone who is here talking to Troy Jackson and all these people who are considering other things, running, whatever it might be. I'm not, right? That's not me. But looking at it from an outside perspective, should Democrats come up 1 seat short in the next cycle, not this one, but the next, in 2028 in the Senate elections, they will look back to Maine as something that is nothing short of a complete and total collapse on their front. Because the 2026 Senate elections, in theory, could look something like this. Maine narrowly goes to the Democratic Party, and it puts Democrats 2 seats away in 2028. And looking at the 2028 map here, I don't think I need to remind you, but I think I can, what this would look like in the right circumstances for Democrats. Republican incumbent in Wisconsin, that's enough if they win the presidency. But let's say they don't. Let's say J.D. Vance is president or somebody else. Wisconsin, North Carolina, that is all Democrats need. Yes, a lot of defense, but in 2022, this map looked like this. That's why these are the incumbents in 2028. And should Democrats take out Ron Johnson finally, a race that was decided by a point, that might be decided by a point in the right direction for Democrats this time. They take out Ron Johnson, go over Ted Budd, who underperformed all the metrics and expectations. Let's say he loses North Carolina, Wisconsin. That would be enough for Democrats, assuming they lose the presidential election. And so what that means here is if Maine doesn't budge and Democrats don't find someone to run in Maine and they lose, they would have to win the presidential election in order to win back Senate control. It would be a 50-50 power sharing agreement, and I think a lot of Democrats have a lot of PTSD looking back to the last time that happened in 2020 and what that looked like in terms of governance, ineffective governance as well, and effective, both ends, but what it looked like. And it wasn't fun for national Democrats. And the bad circumstance here, too, is that this would be assuming Democrats win every single seat. Under the right set of circumstances, if they win Maine, they can afford to lose one as long as they take back the White House. But without Maine, there is no pathway forward to the Senate majority barring an outsized overperformance in the Senate elections in 2028. It is hoop after hoop after hoop, like we're watching, a Harry Potter movie with Quidditch. That many hoops you're jumping through in order to win back the Senate majority. And it's not going to be easy. It is never going to be easy. and Maine is one state right now that if Democrats don't get their act together and they don't recruit someone quickly, their entire pathway forward to winning back the Senate majority by the end of the decade could collapse today. Instead of in 2 years from now, instead of 4 years from now, instead of after they've had 2 years where they could serve out time being in the majority. Because it becomes that much more difficult for things to happen if they just simply do not have the ability to do so because they can't recruit a candidate in a state that has been longing for 2 Democratic senators. Because technically speaking, right now, there are 0. And for it to have been that long, again, reminding that Democrats have won Maine on the presidential level in every election in this century, it will be something the Democrats will remember for a very long time. And Susan Collins and her presence on Capitol Hill in the Senate Appropriations Committee will be there to remind them. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.